So far, I've talked about two individual types in RBY, those being the fighting type and the bug type. And if there's anything those types have in common, it's that they're both kind of fucking bad, unfortunately. They're definitely bad in different ways. Like, the fighting type is just all around really unfortunate. It matches up horribly versus one of the two best types in the game. It has no defensive utility whatsoever. None of the Pokemon with the type are particularly good, and the one redeeming trait of the type, super effective coverage on normal types, is kind of undermined by the fact that all fighting type attacks either have extremely limited distribution or suck. The bug type, on the other hand, is a fundamentally pretty solid type that was just dealt the worst hand you could possibly fucking imagine. Like, it's borderline comical. You've got a type that on paper is actually pretty good, slap it on mostly very weak Pokemon, made only 3 attacks for the type, which vary from to and then out of that very mediocre pool of 3 moves, you take the 2 that are like just about actual moves and slap them on only the very weakest bug Pokemon. Thanks, guys. That was really cool. Love that for you. Now, looking at the ground type on a fundamental level, it's definitely not on the level of the likes of normal or psychic, but I still think it's a very good type, all things considered. I'd probably put it at around 7th best in the game. Offensively, it's pretty good. You're only resisted by grass and bug, and in overuse that pretty much boils down to Exeggutor, which in fairness is pretty fucking scary, and the very occasional Pinsir, which is potentially scary depending on what set it's running and the condition of your team. Also, whether or not it has a Swords Dance. Famously, ground-type attacks have no effect on flying-type Pokemon, and how big of a deal that is generally depends on what tier you're playing. In Overused, it's generally not that big of a factor. Like, the worst-case scenario there is that you give the opponent's Articuno a free switch, which outspeeds and one-hit KOs every relevant ground-type Pokemon in Overused. So, don't let that happen. Ground-type attacks hit 4 types for super effective damage in RBY, those being Poison, Electric, Rock, and Fire. In terms of overuse, this basically boils down to you fuck up Gengar, you fuck up Jolteon, you don't really fuck up Rhydon or the occasional Golem, you just kind of upset them slightly, and Ground being super effective versus Fire basically never comes into play. It does in the lower tiers, but not in Overused. The only fire types you're ever going to see in Overuse for the most part are Moltres, which is genuinely pretty good, but is immune to ground type attacks, and Charizard, which you will see in Overuse from time to time, but I assure you, it's for all the wrong reasons. Charizard fucking sucks in Overused. Also, for the record, when I say ground type attacks, I mean Earthquake, and literally just Earthquake. There are 5 ground type moves, all of them are attacks, and the only one that exists is Earthquake. 2 of them are exclusive to Marowak, who is a complete sack of shit I will touch on later, and the other 2 are banned. Fissure is a one-hit KO move, and those are typically always banned when it comes to Smogon, and the other one is Dig. Dig is just a worse version of Earthquake for the most part. It's the exact same move, but you waste a turn going under. Great fucking game, by the way, you should go try that. But yeah, Dig is also banned because if you get fully paralyzed the turn you're underground with Dig, you kind of gain permanent invincibility for the most part, which, yeah, can't have that. Can't have that. Moving on to the defensive aspects of the ground type, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The ground type has 3 weaknesses. Grass, which is overall pretty manageable. Water, which can vary from pretty manageable to a pretty big fucking problem depending on what tier you're playing. And Ice, which is basically always a fucking problem. There isn't a game of RBY that goes by without something eating a fucking blizzard. That's a problem. In terms of resistances, the ground type is not doing so hot. It only resists Poison and Rock, and that's pretty bad. Poison type attacks basically don't, at all. And I'm not just talking about overuse, like, the strongest one is Sludge and you almost never fucking see it. As for the Rock resistance, it's more relevant, but still not all that relevant. Like, a lot of Pokemon do run Rock Slide, but none of them run it as their main attacking move. It's mostly just a coverage option, so making use of that resistance is pretty difficult. Now, the ground type possesses one absolutely incredible defensive trait, and that's an immunity to Electric. Now, this is obviously nice just for being immune to electric type attacks, because it gives a lot of ground types amazing matchups versus electric type Pokemon. However, on top of that, it also gives you an immunity to Thunder Wave, which is huge. Thunder Wave is one of the most common methods of paralysis spreading, and paralysis is incredibly impactful in RBY, so an immunity to the move is absolutely invaluable. It also means that ground-type Pokemon can actually make pretty good use of Substitute compared to most other Pokemon. Substitute in RBY does not block the likes of Sleep Powder or Thunder Wave, although funnily enough it does block Toxic or Confuse Ray, which is occasionally more relevant in certain lower tiers. However, this is particularly good for ground-type Pokemon since they're naturally immune to Thunder Wave, and if one of your Pokemon is already asleep, then that means you've effectively got a sleep immunity too thanks to Sleep Claws. So you can kind of use Substitute as intended in future games in a way. So overall, the ground type in RBY is fundamentally pretty great. Offensively, it's got a lot going for it, and while the weaknesses are pretty rough, at the same time you've got that electric immunity. That's incredibly valuable, and is honestly worth putting up with the weaknesses for. Now, moving from the type to the Pokemon with that type, things get a little bit tricky. I know usually when I do these, I somewhat try to talk about the Pokemon in order of viability, like from worst to best or best to worst, but I don't think that really works here. I think the ground-type Pokemon in RBY are very, very difficult to order in terms of viability. So instead, I kind of want to group them together in terms of functionality. A lot of ground-type Pokemon are functionally very similar to other ground-type Pokemon. Like, you've got Rhydon and Golem, who, while there's a significant tier gap between them, they're kind of doing very similar things for the most part. And then you've got Nidoking and Nidoqueen, who are like the same, but not really. There is Dugtrio though. Dugtrio you can't group with anyone. Dugtrio is the exception here. Dugtrio's a fucking weirdo. They're a pretty good weirdo, but they're a weirdo nonetheless. With that being said, I'm gonna start off with who is undoubtedly the best ground-type Pokemon in RBY, and that's Rhydon. Okay, I'm also going to talk about Golem a little bit, but mostly Rhydon. Sorry, Golem. Rhydon is a staple of RBY Overused, and it's been a staple of RBY Overused for years. It is an incredibly consistent Pokemon, and is currently ranked 7th on the RBY Overused viability rankings. Now, 7th might not sound that impressive at first, but consider that Rhydon is the highest ranked Pokemon in Overused that isn't a normal or psychic type Pokemon. And suddenly, yeah, that's pretty fucking cool. Rhydon brings a lot to the table in RBY Overused. For a start, it's an incredibly resilient Pokemon with a ton of defensive utility. On top of the fact that it just naturally has really good physical bulk, of course, it's got that electric immunity, which, you know, I've already touched on why that's very good, but it's got a normal resistance on top of that, and that makes it invaluable for baiting the likes of Hyper Beam and Explosion. One of the most satisfying things in RBY is baiting Hyper Beam from the opponent as you bring in your Rhydon, watching Rhydon take barely 20%, and then the opponent being forced to recharge. It's incredible, and on top of feeling sick as fuck, it's something that Rhydon genuinely does fantastically. On top of having amazing defensive utility, Rhydon also does this really cool thing where it hits like an absolute fucking truck. Rhydon's Earthquake is the single strongest physical attack in RBY that doesn't have any kind of a downside attached to it, like Hyper Beam's recharge turn or Explosion killing you. Another really valuable thing that Rhydon's sheer power allows it to do is 2-hit KO Chansey with Earthquake, which does a minimum of just over 50%. This is something that Golem cannot replicate, and it's unfortunately a bit of a reason why Golem has fallen off so much. Rhydon handles a lot of Chansey variants pretty decently, which is a big deal because, you know, Chansey's a big deal. Now yes, you are kinda scared of Ice Beam, which most Chansey variants run, but you've a lot going for you in the matchup. For a start, you're immune to Paralysis because, you know, ground type, you're immune to Thunder Wave, and also, you don't have to worry about any counter shenanigans from Chansey because you're hitting it with Earthquake, which can't be reflected by counter. Lastly, Substitute can potentially have a ton of utility versus Chansey. See, if you set up a Substitute with Rhydon, and Chansey goes for Seismic Toss won't break the Substitute. A lot of Chansey variants only have Seismic Toss when it comes to attacking moves, so they get particularly fucked over by Rhydon. Speaking of good matchups, Zapdos. Rhydon completely shits on Zapdos. Like it's almost sad to see the matchup in action. There's basically nothing Zapdos can do. And this is important because without Rhydon, Zapdos becomes significantly scarier. You've probably seen this image if you've been playing RBY for a while, and this image is important because Zapdos is very notorious for just absolutely wiping unprepared teams. So Rhydon's ability to just completely shut Zapdos down is incredibly valuable. So now that we've touched on why Rhydon is so good in Overused, I think it's important that we talk about why Golem isn't. See, back in the day, Rhydon and Golem were kinda synonymous. They were known as the Rocks. They were both considered around just as good as each other, and which one you picked generally came down to personal preference. Golem's advantages over Rhydon are that it's slightly faster, only a tiny bit though, 45 compared to 40, so you outspeed Rhydon, and that's kinda it actually. Okay, Golem outspeeds Porygon, while Rhydon ties with Porygon. There's that at least. That's something. But more notably, Golem has access to Explosion, while Rhydon doesn't. And that is a very valuable tool to have. Explosion gives Golem a means to break through a lot of Pokemon that it otherwise couldn't, such as Exeggutor for example. But unfortunately, due to the discovery in 2014 that Body Slam can't paralyze normal types, a lot of things in the meta changed that just really did not suit Golem. See, back in the day, Golem would often use its Explosion to break through the likes of Chansey and Snorlax, but now, because of the prevalence of Reflect, since these normal types don't have to fear paralysis from Body Slam over prolonged games, that's a lot harder to do. An Explosion from Golem versus a Pokemon with Reflect is often pretty sad and not worth the sacrifice. And without Explosion, Golem doesn't have that much going for it over Rhydon. Like, yes, you still have Explosion, and that's good, but is it worth it overall? Like, Golem's other stats are significantly worse than Rhydon's for the most part. It's got less attack, it's got less bulk, notably it's got less HP, which means its substitutes will not survive a Seismic Toss, and combined with the fact that unlike Golem, it doesn't have a guaranteed 2-hit KO on Chansey, Golem is a lot worse off versus Chansey, and that's a very important matchup, so it kinda makes sense why Golem has fallen off so much. There's also the fact that Golem just, like, isn't gonna run Substitute, because, like, it needs to run Explosion to still have some kind of a niche, even though that niche has fallen off a lot. It's unfortunate, really. Golem can occasionally shine in Overuse still, there's no doubt about it. But Rhydon's traits are just generally preferred now due to how the meta has shifted. Golem's lower damage output is really detrimental with some matchups. Like, versus Snorlax, Rhydon's Earthquake is a near guaranteed 3-hit KO, while Golem's is pretty sad. You've got a 0.5% chance for a 3-hit KO. And like I mentioned, you don't have a consistent 2-hit KO on Chansey. And that's huge. Not only did Golem drop from Overused, but it dropped from Underused as well. Golem in Underused just didn't work. There's too many good water types, too many good special attackers, so it dropped again to Never Used. But in Never Used, it's actually really good. It's serving a very unique role, and it fills that role excellently. So, while it's a pretty significant drop, at least it's got something to do now. And listen, Golem fans, if you're upset by this, just play Gen 2. In Generation 2 Overused, Golem is pretty significantly better than Rhydon. Also, just before we move on to the next Pokemon, a fun Rhydon fact that I think is neat. Rhydon's move pool doesn't really change all that often. Like, it's had the same concrete set of 4 moves for a very long time, and fair enough, it's a really fucking good set. But people do occasionally experiment with other options, like Rest, Counter, but my personal favorite is Surf, which sounds really fucking stupid, but in the Rhydon mirror, it's technically your strongest option. It does it like 10 to 12% more than Earthquake, which isn't amazing. It's not really enough to warrant running it, but I do think it's very cool nonetheless. Also, if you're completely insane, you can run Bubble Beam, because if you use Bubble Beam on the opponent's Rhydon, and you get the 33% chance of a speed drop, then you're guaranteed to outspeed them the next turn and KO with Earthquake, which is very funny. Very funny, that's all I'm going to say about that. Now, one way you could look at Golem is like a slightly weaker version of Rhydon that tries to make up for its worst stats by having some unique tools, like it's a tiny bit faster and it has Explosion. Now, in the same vein, you could look at Onyx like a weaker version of Golem that has worse stats again, but makes up for it by having better speed, base 70 compared to 40 or 45, and it has another unique tool on top of Explosion in Bind. Now the difference is that Golem was like slightly worse in terms of stats than Rhydon. Onyx is genuinely struggling to keep up with fucking Graveler. Onyx's cheeks. And let's talk about why. Onyx does have quite a lot of options, but the problem is so do good Pokemon. And because of that, Onyx is currently in PU. And not only is it in PU, but it kinda fucking blows in PU. It's not completely unusable, but the issue is it faces heavy competition from Graveler, who is generally considered to be much better. That being said, RBY PU is still quite early days, so who knows, maybe someone's gonna find some fucking crazy Onyx tech, but probably not. Onyx's good traits include its very, very high defense stat of 160. Funnily enough, this is the third highest individual stat in RBY, after Chansey's HP and Cloyster's defense. However, because of its absolutely miserable HP, it's actually got less physical bulk than both Rhydon and Golem, so it's not as bulky as you'd think. That speed stat of 70 is actually quite decent, and it pairs well with the fact that Onyx gets Bind. A partial trapping move is always a very good option to have, although it is worth noting that Bind isn't the best of them. It's kinda just an objectively worse version of Wrap due to the lower accuracy. So those are all of Onyx's good traits. Onyx's bad traits include being Onyx, and the opponent's Pokemon probably not being Onyx. The rest of its stats are genuinely miserable. It's got a pathetic attack stat of 45, which, honestly, is probably lower than what my attack stat would be, and I'm a pretty feeble little character. I fell over on stream the other day, and like, it was the most baby fall ever, and it really hurt. It really hurt. Ah! That's like the first time I've fallen over in a long time, and it hurt like more than it should. I'm gonna need a fucking new hip by the time I'm like 40. But yeah, I could probably take Onyx, to be honest. Remember how I mentioned that Rhydon can always 2-hit KO Chansey with Earthquake while Golem can't? Yeah, with Onyx it's a 4-hit KO. And at the very least, Golem can use Explosion to 1-hit KO Chansey. With Onyx, 60 to 70%. It doesn't even always kill after an Earthquake, which is fucking crazy to think about. Onyx can't even 1-hit KO Butterfree 100% of the time with Rock Slide, which is 4 times super effective. Onyx's incredibly low HP also gives it absolutely miserable special bulk. Earlier I mentioned Rhydon Surf, which is a very, very weak special move, but it does around 78% to Rhydon and 81% to Golem, best case scenario. Versus Onyx, it does nearly 120% minimum. Which, like, that's pretty fucking sad. I remember when I made my 7U video, some people were surprised that Onyx wasn't bad enough to be a part of the tier. And I had a look, and it turns out that Onyx was barely hanging on to 6U, going off the old Pokemon Perfect tiers. In 6U, it wasn't that great. It was barely hanging on to C rank. And it's worth noting that on the old Pokemon Perfect tiers, Graveler was 5U, not 6U. If Onyx had to compete with Graveler in 6U, I've no doubt it would have dropped out of the tier and would have had nothing to do. So overall, Onyx is a pretty miserable Pokemon. It's weird that its stats are this bad, honestly. You kinda wonder how that happened. Like, it's a giant fucking rock snake. Like, part of me wonders if when they were making RBY, they designed Onyx, gave it decent stats, and then they were like, shit, we need a weak, fully evolved rock type to put on Brock's team. And they just gutted Onyx to make it work. Either way, it's a very, very unfortunate Pokemon. Next up, we've got Dugtrio, who is a pretty simple one, and the only ground type who's ranked as underused. And in underused, it's pretty fucking great. On the UU viability rankings, it's currently tied for 3rd with Kadabra, and they're sort of, kind of similar in a way. Sort of. Dugtrio is one of UU's premier revenge killers, thanks to its amazing speed stat of 120 and fantastic coverage. 80 attack isn't anything that crazy, but of course Earthquake is an amazing move to have, and thanks to its fantastic speed stat, Dugtrio has a very nice crit rate. Earthquake and Rock Slide give Dugtrio phenomenal coverage in the tier. Slash is just a good, safe, high damage attack that's nice to throw out when you're not sure what's going to come in. Substitute is good to compensate for Dugtrio's meager bulk when you get a free turn. And Toxic was kind of a staple on Dugtrio, but I think that's going to change now with the recent ban of Agility and Partial Trapping on the same set. This was mainly used to deal with that on Dragon Knight, and now that that's banned, you're probably going to see it much less. Now, Dugtrio does have a few problems in underused for sure. It's pretty strong, but without crits, it's not quite hitting as hard as you'd want, and like, on top of its very meager bulk, all three of its weaknesses are very relevant in the tier, especially with the abundance of very good water types. On top of that, it's got a very, very nasty matchup versus Tangela, who gives it a ton of trouble, and notably can paralyze Dugtrio with Stun Spore. You are immune to electric type moves like Thunder Wave, but you're not completely immune to paralysis, so you gotta watch out for that. And Body Slam paralysis, there's the issue of that too. Lastly, just in case you're wondering, while it is a very good UU Pokemon, Dugtrio has absolutely no business in overused. Don't get any ideas, it really does not work. Next up we've got Nidoking and Nidoqueen, who are a pretty interesting pair. Now, Nidoking is currently in Never Used, and it's a great Pokemon in the tier, currently ranked at 7th on the viability rankings. Now, the Poison type in RBY isn't exactly good, and by that I mean it typically fucking sucks, but believe it or not, Nidoking actually gets a bit of utility out of its Poison typing. See, of course it's immune to Thunder Wave because of the ground typing, but the toxic immunity that it gets from its Poison type is actually quite relevant in Never Used. See, partial trapping is a big part of Never Used, it's quite common, and because of that, spreading Toxic and Paralysis are both quite common because that pairs quite nicely with partial trapping. Thanks to its immunities to both of these statuses, Nidoking can come in on Pokemon trying to spread them and hit them hard with its incredible coverage. Nidoqueen on the other hand wasn't quite so lucky, and for the longest time you almost never saw this Pokemon. See, Nidoking is a mixed attacker, that's its primary role, and Nidoqueen is like the defensive counterpart to Nidoking, but it doesn't quite work. Like, one of the biggest issues with Nidoking is its weaknesses. You know, it's not amazing defensively outside of its immunities, but Nidoqueen is trying to be a defensive Pokemon, but it's still got these like core issues, and yeah, it doesn't quite work out. Now, Nidoqueen isn't like useless in Never Used, like the extra bulk can occasionally help you out. Like, for example, it's common knowledge at this point that men have a 2.6% chance of dying to a Golem explosion, while women will always survive one. Everyone else, I'm not really sure what the deal is for you. If I ever tank a Golem explosion, I'll let you know how it goes. The lower attack does really hurt Nidoqueen though. For example, Nidoking has a very good chance to 2-hit KO Golem with Earthquake, and to 3-hit KO Clefable, while Nidoqueen has pretty miserable chances, which is a real shame. Now, funnily enough, Nidoqueen not having much going for her in RBY Never Used actually turned out to be a bit of a blessing in disguise, because once RBY PU rolled around, it meant that she dropped to PU, and there, not only is Nidoqueen a fantastic Pokemon, but it looks like she's shaping up to be the best Pokemon in the tier, which, like, you love to see it. Fucking go off, Queen. Now, there's no official viability rankings for RBY PU yet, it's still pretty early days, like I said, but it's fairly safe to say that she's number 1. She is absolutely fantastic in the tier. Not having to compete with Nidoking and the overall lower power level is absolutely fantastic for her. And funnily enough, this is kind of similar to what's going on with the Nidos in Generation 2. In Generation 2 Overused, Nidoking is a great Pokemon. While Nidoqueen doesn't really have anything going for her in Overused, she is the best Pokemon in Generation 2 Underused, which is pretty cool. You love to see it. Next up, we've got Sandslash, who is pretty interesting in that it's another PU ground type, but unlike Nidoqueen, it's actually got a niche in Overused, and that's as a Swords Dance user. Now, Sandslash in Overused is pretty interesting. It's not a staple, I mean, if it was, it would be Overused instead of PU, but it's a decent Pokemon in its own right. As a Swords Dance user in Overused, it's got a lot of attractive traits. being immune to Thunder Wave is massive, as it gives you some opportunities to set up your sword stance, and also, the other sword stance users are typically just completely destroyed by paralysis, like Kingler for example. Like, that really kills their momentum, so not having to worry about Thunder Wave paralysis is a big deal. Also, having access to Earthquake, Stab Earthquake no less, and Rock Slide is really nice for coverage. Now on the flip side, Sandslash isn't quite as strong as some of the other sword stance users. It's only got 100 base attack, which isn't all that great compared to Kingler's 130 for example. And also, it's quite slow, only having base 65 speed. In PU, Sandslash is shaping up to be quite good. It doesn't rely on sword stance as much, it's just like a good physical attacker, and it's actually got the strongest Earthquake in the tier. However, it faces a lot of competition from Pinsir, who seems to be shaping up to be a better physical attacker overall, thanks to its better speed, access to bind, and also, in Overused, Pinsir has to deal with the absolutely abysmal Gengar matchup. Pinsir literally cannot touch Gengar without Seismic Toss, and even then that's only a 4-hit KO. However, in PU, it only has to deal with Ghastly, who isn't as prevalent in PU as Gengar is in Overused, so that's a big factor. And on top of that, it can also 3-hit KO it with Seismic Toss if, you know, that's your thing. Now, Pinsir isn't strictly better than Sandslash in PU. It has to worry about paralysis a lot more, and unlike in Overused, Pinsir's fire weakness is actually very relevant. There's a lot of excellent fire types in PU, like Rapidash, Arcanine, and believe it or not, Magmar, who I haven't thought about in fucking years. But yeah, that's all very relevant, and for Sandslash, that's not as big of an issue. So, keep it in mind if you're ever playing the tier. Again, RBY PU is quite early days, but I recommend you check it out anyways, it's shaping up to be pretty cool. Speaking of pretty cool, just kidding, we're gonna talk about Marowak. Marowak sucks complete shit in RBY and has absolutely nothing to do in any official tier. Marowak has the same defense stat as Sandslash, and then everything else is strictly worse. This Pokemon is genuinely miserable, and it just doesn't have anything to do. It does have a few unique tools over Sandslash, like it's got Counter, Blizzard, and Fire Blast, but like, what would you rather have? Sandslash with Rock Slide and Sword Stance, or Marowak with this gimmicky move where you pray your opponent hits you with the right thing, or a Blizzard coming off 50 base special? Yeah, I think you take Sandslash. As long as Sandslash is in PU, Marowak is never going to achieve anything. This Pokemon is genuinely pathetic. Now looking at the old Pokemon Perfect tiers, Marowak was decent in RBY 6U, but that is solely due to the lack of competition. Sandslash wasn't in 6U, which meant that Marowak actually existed. As long as this thing is in the same tier as Sandslash, it will never achieve anything. Marowak is genuinely a nothing Pokemon. It's absolutely miserable. I'm sorry the vid has to go out like this. Like, what a fucking nothing Pokemon to end on. Just wait until Generation 2, right? Just wait till it gets the Thick Club, then it actually exists. I promise. So there you go. That was a look at all 7 fully evolved ground-type Pokemon in RBY, featuring Marowak from Pokemon Gold and Silver. I hope you enjoyed this. It's been a while since I did one of these videos focusing on one specific type, but they're fun. They're fun. They're a nice change of pace. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will hopefully get up to some more cool shit in the future. Have a good one.